On behalf of the network, Marc Rothenberg and I will present current results from the survey on the impact of coronavirus disease 19 on people with rare diseases. A year ago, the effect of the looming pandemic on the health of people with rare diseases was largely unknown. There were real concerns that these conditions may lead to more severe infections with SARS-CoV-2, the causative virus of COVID-19. And COVID-19 could greatly complicate some rare diseases, even those who are uninfected. I mean, we had real difficulties stocking personal protective equipment in hospitals and clinics. So if we had shortages of something as basic as masks and gowns, how would the pandemic affect the supply and availability of medications, specialized diets, and equipment often needed to treat rare diseases? So last year, about this time, we developed a survey to help us understand what COVID-19 means to this population. The purpose of this study is to understand the impact of the pandemic on people with rare diseases. It was a cross-sectional survey with the intention to conduct follow-up data collection in future studies. People who have a rare disease and live in the United States were the target group, and their parents or caregivers when appropriate. The study and the survey was reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. And it's important to note that the survey was not limited to those who just had proven COVID-19 infection, but also collected information from people who are uninfected or symptomatic but undiagnosed to determine how COVID-19 affected the lives of individuals with rare diseases. The survey was advertised by the National Institutes of Health, individual consortia, and patient advocacy groups. Over 4,000 surveys were received by mid-December, and nearly 3,500 surveys comprise the analytic data set that you'll see after we remove the blank and duplicate responses. Almost twice as many women than men answered the survey. Also, disproportionately few minorities responded, and that was consistent across all of the highest enrolling consortia. Some of the conditions represented are listed here and cross the spectrum of rare diseases. When we analyzed the responses, a low percentage of people with rare diseases had known COVID-19, but a larger number just weren't sure. I'll let Marc now describe the results in more detail.
This slide shows the symptoms and the SARS-2 infection status. I'd like to draw your attention to the low panel in the graph because these are the individuals that responded yes versus no, that they did have the COVID infection. One can see that the people with the rare disease report having symptoms that are typical of that are already been associated with COVID, including a high rate of weakness, confusion, loss of smell, muscle aches, wheezing, chest pain, stuffy nose, new or increased shortness of breath, and a new or increased cough. We also found that the patients that reported having COVID required urgent or emergent care about 39% of the time. 10% of those patients, 7 of them, were hospitalized. 17% or 12 of the patients required supplemental oxygen. 6% required mechanical ventilation, and 13% received investigational drugs. The mean duration of symptoms was 27 days. 37% of the patients still had symptoms not yet resolved at the time of completion of the survey. Most notably, in terms of their rare disease, 44% of the patients indicated that the rare disease was indeed complicated by the COVID illness. 55% of the patients also reported that the rare disease symptoms were worsened by the COVID illness. The impact of the pandemic on healthcare in general is shown in this slide. Drawing your attention to the left graph, this section answers if symptomatic, were you able to get advice from the healthcare provider regarding COVID-19 testing. Patients that had rare diseases reported that most of them who acquired the infection were able to seek out provider care, and those who did not were more likely not to, was not applicable. So the main point is that care was available to the rare disease patients by and large. On the right panel, one can see that since the pandemic, we're able to continue to see healthcare providers. One can see that the patients that acquired the infection had a high rate of patients, about 40% saying that they were able to acquire appointments at reasonable amount of time, where others conducted a fair amount of patients by telemedicine. Similar proportions were seen, although a higher percentage of patients reported using telemedicine. The impact of the pandemic on specialty care is reviewed in his slides. In this particular slide on the left panel, one can see what happened to the treatment of the patient's rare disease during the pandemic. If the patient reported acquiring the infection, one can see that about 15% of the patients had indeed a supply that was delayed, 10% had a supply that was interrupted. Patients that did not acquire COVID had, by and large, ready access to treatment of their rare disease, with a smaller percentage indicating that they had delays. On the right graph, one is looking at the response to the question, were you able to maintain your diet or access to food necessary for the treatment of rare disease? One can see the patients that acquired the infection reported that about 15% of them had a supply delay, and nearly 10% reported that the supply was interrupted. Patients that did not acquire the infection reported a slightly higher access to treatment, medical foods that were necessary for their treatment. And however, there were still substantial numbers of patients that either had supply delayed or supply interrupted. The impact of the pandemic on mental health is reviewed in this slide. The left graph shows the effect of the pandemic on mood or behavior changes that particularly required medical attention. One can see in the patient that acquired the infection that approximately 20% of the patients needed to seek out medical attention for behavior or mood problems. A little bit smaller percentage, but substantial numbers of patients that did not acquire the infections also reported the need for medical attention related to mood or behavior changes. In terms of the right graph, this is answering the question of, have you or your members of your family sought professional support coping with stress or anxiety? In this case, there were higher percentages that reported yes, they were seeking support for stress or anxiety. This was higher in the patients that reported COVID. Nearly 40% of them required support. About 20% required support, even if they did not have COVID-19. So, taking all of this together, the conclusions that we can draw from this study is that COVID-19 infection was reported by few respondents without a clear pattern of association with particular consortia or disease category. We interpret this to mean that in general, rare diseases do not appear to markedly increase the risk and severity of COVID-19. There appears to be an association between COVID-19 associated symptoms and self-reported infection status, with specific symptoms such as loss of smell and taste associated more strongly with those reported acquiring the infection than those who were uncertain about it, and also those who had an intermediate pattern. Access to testing or advice on COVID-19 was more difficult among those who did not know whether they acquired COVID-19. The pandemic negatively affected access to treatment for the rare disease, specifically diet therapy and hospitalization. The pandemic also caused mood changes and anxiety in both patients and their families to the extent that they required medical attention. In terms of future studies, we are particularly interested in understanding the reasons for the limited racial distribution found in this study. This is now being further studied by the network, and we're particularly interested in why this was a general phenomenon across all the consortia and apparently all the rare diseases. More attention to this is certainly worthy. We are also conducting collaboration with the Lab of Infectious Disease at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, a study that will examine antibody titers against the causative virus SARS-CoV-2 and associate that with self-reported infection and exposure history. We are building from this study another follow-up study examining the effectiveness of immunizations in the rare disease population, and this is currently under early discussions with the NIH. I'd like to acknowledge the absolute necessity of Dr. Eileen King and Mauricio Macaluso from the Data Management Coordinating Center of the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. These two leaders of the DMCC played an essential role along with their survey team members who are indicated here. This was supported not only by the parent grant, but also a supplement that was granted to these investigators. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone. It's Ann Pariser from ORDR back again. First, I'd like to thank Drs. Ferkol and Rothenberg very much for presenting these very interesting results. We have time for a couple of questions, so I'd like to start with you, Dr. Ferkol. You presented a lot of data. Can you tell me or tell us if there were any findings that surprised you in the survey, or if there were any findings that particularly stood out to you from the survey?
I think there were two. I think the first was the remarkable disparity, ethnic and racial disparity in respondents. And I think we need to understand a lot more about why that occurred. The other is the impact the pandemic has had on people's mental health. And not even individuals with rare diseases who were infected, but people who are not infected. It has a much greater effect than I think.
Hello, my name is Lisa Kosek, and I'm honored to be here.
Oh, sorry about that. Please continue.
No, I'm done.
Thank you. Those are very important findings. Thank you very much. And a similar question for you, Dr. Rothenberg. So can you share any of the findings from the survey that you think might inform the work of the RDCRN as we move forward, hopefully post-pandemic in the near term?
Yes, I would. Thank you for the question. The survey indicates to us as a network that we need to continue to do more to understand the heterogeneity amongst different rare diseases and how an acute event like the COVID-19 is impacting the various diseases. We can see by and large that the rare diseases as a whole did not have apparent greater risk for COVID than we would expect in the general population, and that's a good message in general. However, I think we need to look more carefully and look at all the different patients, look at the different patients as a function of age, their medications, as well as their underlying disease to find out exactly which diseases, if any, were more susceptible to the problem. What's also notable to me was the high degree of medical attention that was needed for behavioral and mood problems. And we need to look and also to understand why patients with rare diseases, even if they didn't acquire COVID, had a 40% response rate to the need for mental health input. So these are important issues that I think the RDCRN should continue to address.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to you both. We look forward to hearing more as the data are analyzed moving forward. So unfortunately, we're out of time. We did have a number of questions pouring in, but please feel free to reach out through the app. So again, our thank yous to you and to all of the RDCRN for the survey. And thank you again to the Planning Committee for allowing us to speak today.